In this video, I'm going to be procedurally texturing the turret. Make sure you have Node Wrangler enabled. So in the last video, we set up our materials and they're all masked out. So we can now go through piece by piece and texture them individually. So I'm going to be starting with the base. And I'm going to try and make this a sort of sandstone desert material. If you've played games like COD or Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts, you'll know these desert levels where there's these sort of dried out sand buildings, and that's the general look I'm going for. So start with a couple of noise nodes, add in texture coordinates and a color ramp. If you're completely new to procedural texturing, there is a video in my texturing playlist. It's a series actually on all the different types of ways you can texture in Blender from basic to advanced. This one's under the advanced. Procedural is in the advanced video. So if you just need a quick overview before you get going with this, I recommend checking that video out. So we're adding noise for the detail, and then the color ramp is going to give us the variation in the color. And we can set as many stops on this color ramp as we want, and we can move them around. So when you add in a texture like a noise node, you can press Ctrl T, and that'll add in the texture coordinates and mapping nodes. If you Control Shift click on any node, it will preview everything up to that point. Plug the normal map in through a bump, and we can then add in noise through the height channel, and this will raise parts of the bump up off of the surface. And the key to good procedural texturing is to think of it in layers, and you layer increasing amounts of complexity. You want some parts of the shader to be driving the color, others to be driving the bump. You might want it to affect the roughness or the metallic. Later on, I'll be showing you how you can also mask individual areas out, so that you can texture them entirely differently. So you haven't got to have, say, one material over the whole surface. So it's looking pretty good so far for like a sandy material. If we just plug in the mapping coordinates, Control Shift D will duplicate a node with everything connected still up to it. So you can see there I just duplicate that noise node with Control Shift D, and it's still got the mapping plugged in. And what I'm doing here is I'm basically adding another layer of detail to drive another part of bump, so that we can get some sort of cracked surface on this base. Duplicate the bump node, and you'll see it automatically plugs in the previous one to the normal, which is very helpful. And if we plug this into the height, you can see we get some sort of raised up parts. It makes it look a lot more like it's sort of crumbling away, because again, if you picture this in a desert environment, you can sort of think of it as crumbling away. And the cool thing about it being procedural is we can just affect the entire scale of the whole thing over the model with the mapping coordinates. Just drop that down to 0.3. You can also adjust the overall hue, saturation, and value with this node. So even if your color ramp isn't quite how you want it to look, like for this one, for example, I didn't feel it had enough yellow in it, so I just shifted the hue slightly. You can also change the brightness and contrast with this node. If you don't know the name of the, if you can't find the node in the menus, there's also a search function when you shift A for add, sorry. And just looking around the model, just seeing what it looks like. You can rotate the texture on the whole model as a whole, in case you want some of the cracks and damage to be in specific areas, but that's looking pretty good for now. A lot of it is sort of fine-tuning the colours and brightness of it to get what you're hoping for is a sort of realistic look. Most things in the real world aren't particularly saturated, so you can always drop the saturation down. Okay, moving on to the next part now, which is these chrome parts. And the way to do this is for each part we're going through, so the base, the chrome parts, the gold parts, and the main body, you sort of work through in stages. So you can work on the base color first, then the metal, then the roughness, then the bump. But you can also add in edge wear and masks, which we'll be doing shortly. For now, I want to change it from looking like chrome to a sort of galvanized steel. So I'm just setting up Voronoi texture. And I've used the color rather than the distance to plug into the color ramp. You'll see me going back and forth quite a bit with trying out different looks to see what works and what doesn't. Although I want this to be galvanized steel, I'm bearing in mind it is in the desert, so it's intended to be sitting in some sort of desert environment. So most of the metal will be completely blasted by sandstorms and things, so it's going to be quite rough and non-reflective. The pattern's looking pretty good. Quite impressed with that. Can add a bit of bump. So again, plug the normal through a bump node, and then we can plug the pattern through the height to get different effects. And we obviously, you don't want it that strong, so you can drop it down a bit. A lot of the time with the bump, you want quite subtle effects. And you can always add in an extra layer of noise if you want. As I said in the texturing video, most things procedurally come down to noise, ramps, and bump. And between those three things, you can make most effects, including masks to mask out different areas. So although I'm making this metal look like how I want it to look to begin with, the galvanized steel, I'm also then going to add a second material and mask out certain areas to show as rust underneath. Excuse me. So just fiddling around with the values of this bump. I just want it to be very subtle. So I'm going to duplicate the BSDF. And this second one, this is basically going to become the rust material that is going to show through underneath. So we need another mix node, a mix shader node, sorry. And I'm just going to leave that on bright green for the minute, just so we can see where it is. And just adding that into the normal shader tree, a value of 1. And now we're going to make a edge mask. So there's several ways of doing this. This is one that I've recently found that I quite like. So use the bevel shader combined with a geometry node, and then mix RGB set to difference, and a color ramp so you can clamp the values if you need to. And that's not appearing yet. Oh, it's because I've not plugged the normal up to the color 2. So if I put the normal in there, it's trying to work out the difference between a bevel on the edge and the normals of all the faces. Which, as you can see at the moment, will give us that black line. And we can affect how thick that, that spreads onto the model. We can add in noise to break up the effect. And we want quite a bit of noise because we want it to get quite choppy where this mask actually shows through. A lot of these values I have worked out before doing this, just so you know. I'm not just like some Rain Man that knows the values off the top of my head. There's a lot of trial and error involved, and it would make a very long, excruciatingly long video if I did this all in real time. Even doing it with the values already worked out, it was still over an hour, so I've time-lapsed it to half an hour. So you can see the mask there working, so it's showing the green through from the second material. We're not leaving it green, obviously. That's going to be a rust colour when we work on that, which we'll do now. So I'm just going to add in a noise. And a colour ramp. And you'll see me doing this over and over again, noise and colour ramp. And put that into the base colour. And then if we Control-Shift-Click on the final mix shader node, the one that goes to the output, it brings back all the material for the whole model. And now we can start adjusting the values. So the rust is very small scale detail, but I do want some colour variation in there. So I'm going to want some different types of browns, some darker browns, lighter browns, and maybe some yellow spots in there as well. For reference, I actually found, just in the process of making this video, I actually found a galvanized rusty door somewhere and took a photo just so I could actually try and get the colours right for what it actually looks like in real life. It's a bit saturated at the moment. And the cool thing with doing all this procedurally is you can always use masks or noise from other parts of the model to plug back in. And you'll see later on that does save us some time when I start layering up scratches and dirt on the model. So that noise looks quite contrasty at the moment for the rust, but bear in mind I'm very zoomed in. So we can adjust the brightness and contrast, and also the hue and saturation. the value node on the hue saturation is basically the same as the brightness. As far as I can tell, it does the same thing. So I'm just going to remove all of the roughness and specularity from the rust. Just to make it very distinctively different from the metal parts, which are shiny. I want the rust to be completely non-shiny. They probably do have some in real life, but for the purposes of this, I want it to, because it's going to be viewed at a bit of a distance, I want it to be noticeably far away, noticeably different. So I'm just going to add in a bump node for the height of the rust, just so that the metal material, the galvanized metal, will sit slightly higher than the rust. For scene organization, you can also add in frames and label them. If you press N to bring up the side panel, you can then label your frames and drop nodes in there. This really helps when you start getting a complicated scene put together with lots of different layers of effects and masks, and trying to remember what part is for which. So I want a frame for masks, and I want this to be the edgeware. And this is going to be the rust color. Just helps keep everything organized so you can see what you're doing. And then I'm going to work on a layer of sort of chips and scratches next. So using two Voronoi textures, I'm going to use one to mask out parts of the other one. And I kind of want this to create a sort of speckled rust all over the thing. Through trial and error, I know this it can be hit or miss, so it kind of ended up being more chips rather than speckled rust. The speckled effect just kind of covered too much area. It was quite difficult to remove the part, just individual parts here and there. As you can see there, it's just sort of added these sort of random shaped chips all over the model. And I'm just going to add that to its own frame, call it chips, and then put that in the masks frame once I spell chips right. Okay, drop that underneath there. Next, I basically want to do the same thing as the chips, but this time I want it to be scratches. So we can again use a Voronoi texture and a color ramp. And with this one, I want to use distance to edge because this gives us these lines everywhere. And we want very small values on these. A very small difference. And we can play around with the scale. Control-Shift-D to duplicate and keep them connected. And you can see here I've separated the mapping so that it's just for the second set of noise. That's because I want to control where it is slightly differently. Add in another mix node. Set it to add, clamp, and factor 1. And everywhere there's a circle on the second one, we'll kind of cut off the edges of the lines in the first noise texture. For edgeware, we can plug that in as another mix. And then if we put that on as well, we get the scratches and the chips and the rust all coming through. So you've got the edgeware, the chips, and the scratches. And then we can play around with the scale of the scratches. I think sometimes it's better to have some that are kind of elongated and some that are squashed, just to give it a bit more variety, because it does look very uniform otherwise using the Voronoi method. It looks quite good on these parts though. So we're going to add that to its own frame and again put that in with the other masks. To label that scratches. And then this last one I want to do, I'm going to use a gradient texture and I'm going to add a layer of dirt. And the cool thing with this, as you'll see, is you can sort of make the dirt come up from a certain direction by affecting the mapping coordinates. And to do this, you'll see that I had to make sure the pivot point is in the center of the object. And also all the scale and rotation are applied. Change the color ramp to constant. And I've already got some values written down for this so that I know exactly what I'm typing in. And you can see there, as I move the X value, this now moves up from the bottom to the top. And we can add in noise to this gradient. And I'm going to mix that with the mapping. And you can see we now get noise on the edge of that black and white gradient. Just neaten things up a little bit. And although it's on the model as a whole, you can see because it's masked out through the materials, we can control how far that creeps up the model, but just on the metal parts this is affecting. And I just want it to creep up on that edge part around there because it's sitting in a recessed bit of concrete or sand or whatever that base thing is. So you'd imagine that if there is any moisture in the air, although there's probably not much being in the desert, it would sort of gather in the bottom of there and cause it to rust from the bottom up. So just adding this to its own frame and putting it in with the other masks. Now that we've got this gradient dirt layer, we can reuse this for other parts. So I'm going to duplicate those nodes and use it for to add some more to the base that we've already done. So select all these nodes, Shift D to duplicate, and then Alt P to remove from the frame. And we can bring these all the way down here to where our base material was. And just tidy these up a little bit. Add in a mix RGB into where the colour is. I'll just move all this back, it won't keep bumping the nodes over at the front. And you can see we can use this as a mask. If we plug this into the factor, you see if I darken that, it's masking out that specific area with that specific noise. And I'm just going to put in this colour that I've already wrote down. And now I'm just going to adjust some of these values. I want the noise to be much more elongated in the Z direction. So I'm going to adjust the scale slightly and change the position. And I kind of want this to look like you've got the sandstone material underneath and then this layer of clay or concrete on the top, or mud or whatever you want to call it, where they've basically slathered it on to basically stop it from falling apart, so it can hold this gun that they've put there. And just working on the roughness now, so I'm copying the default roughness into color 2 into the value socket 0.68, and then I want to create a variation in the roughness for the clay or mud at the top, just so it's not going to be super shiny, but it's going to pick up a few more highlights than the sandstone underneath will. Again, these are all values I've already worked out, so don't worry if you're having to sit there and trial and error it. That's exactly what I did. I'm just showing you the quick version for the sake of this not being a 6-hour video. And just adding that in through the bump as well, so it's slightly raised up off the surface. And it's quite hard to see here because it's not rendering super quick. I don't have the fastest graphics card in the world. I just want it to catch a few little highlights here and there when this mud is in the light. Just going to move all this up out of the way a little bit. And next we're going to work on this this gold material. Oh, one other thing I did with the mud on the base was I tilted it. Because it's procedural, you can change the mapping rotation. So I actually made it dip further down on the right hand side of the model and be higher up on the left hand side. So I'm going to set up a slight variation in this gold material. I was toying with the idea of having brushed metal, but it just didn't look right with the other details there. So I've gone for a basic, slight bit of variation in the noise for this gold metal, but we'll be doing some fancy things to the gold on the barrel at the back. So just plugging that in for a start, and you can see there the variation on the front. And we can plug that in through the height and just get a very subtle bump, just for some variation. We're again going to duplicate the dirt and separate it from the other frame with Alt-P. Plug in the map in. And I'm just changing some of these settings to, again, stuff I've already worked out. So I've got this dirt texture that I had before, and I can change all the mapping coordinates. Don't worry about what these values, these are just things I know. So I've tilted this to 60 degrees. And if you remember from when we did the modeling, the drum on the back is at 30 degrees, which means these now line up. I know that doesn't make sense, 30 and 60, but for some reason it's 30 and 60. So I can move that along to just the back of the model. And this is a bit of visual storytelling. So this ammo drum obviously gets loaded in and out of this turret. And so I wanted to have some sort of scratched or worn effect just on that part that slides in, both into the carrier itself and from the, say they get delivered in some sort of caddy truck thing and get hoisted out by a crane, the underside of it would get scuffed and scratched and worn from that happening. So that's what this bit of damage on here is. Still fine-tuning the colours of the gold because it's a bit dark. I want it to look more like gold paint than necessarily solid gold, obviously. Just fine-tuning the roughness. And again, this is another little thing I just kind of figured this out while I was playing around with it. Another type of mask you can use, so that you can mask. This is just another way you can mask out areas of the model to texture with different shapes if you want to. So I'm just copying down the gradient texture nodes, but I'm using, instead of using noise, I'm using 2 mapping nodes and a difference set between them, which doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment, but it will in a moment when you see what it does. So just typing in these values that I've already figured out. And I do need to adjust some of these color stops on these ramps as well. And you can see that gives us this band, which we can now move and resize across any part of the model and use it as a mask. And the reason I've got it at this angle is because it's going to mask out the area on the barrel that's got the grooves either side. So at the moment it's over there. If we adjust the mapping, we can move it to another area. So this was on 0, I believe. And you'll see it's going to fit in there between the parts that we've got from the normal map, which are causing those dents. One thing I do want to do with this band, though, is I want to use it to mask out both the bump from the gold material and also the bump from the damage from the scratches. So I don't want the scratches to be on this part. So I'm going to make it look like it's a different material altogether. And if we plug that through there, we can then control the color of it. So I'm just going to type in the hex value for the color that I worked out previously. It's just a sort of darkened gold color. And I'm going to use that later to maybe add, say, a sticker or a decal of some sort. And the cool thing about this all being procedural, you can see if I move this up or down, it removes, wherever I move it to, it's going to remove those other parts of the mask. Next, we're going to move on to the main body of the thing. And this one's quite simple. We're just going to have some color variation and then a slight bump. So a couple of noise textures, just to make some variation with the pattern. And with Node Wrangler, if you select 2 nodes, like I did with these 2 color ramps, and press Ctrl-0, it'll automatically add in a mix RGB node with everything connected. These are all little things I find out while I'm working sometimes, and I just find them useful, so I try and add them into my video. And the cool thing with a procedural setup like this, we can always go back and change any part at any time. And when we're happy with it, we can bake it down into a set of PBR maps, which we'll be doing in the next video. Just going to add this in as a bump as well. And that's giving it this sort of plastic coating. You can see there. See you in the next part. Thanks for watching. Take care.